Story 1: The Shadowed Hallway. When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled by the vintage charm it exuded. However, I quickly noticed an odd occurrence: a shadow that seemed to flit past the end of the hallway when the light was just right. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination, but it happened too frequently to ignore. One night, I was woken from a deep sleep by a loud thud in the hallway. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone for light and stepped out of my room. The air felt heavy, thick with an unshakable tension. As I crept down the hallway, I saw it again. A dark figure standing at the end, just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall and indistinct, but I could feel its presence. I froze, unable to decide whether to run back to my room or confront it. Summoning my courage, I called out, "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder. I took a step forward, and as I did, the shadow darted down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. I chased after it, my heart pounding, but when I turned the corner, there was nothing, just empty space and silence. I spent the rest of the night with my lights on, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I decided to investigate the history of the building and discovered that a man had died in a mysterious accident in that very hallway many years ago. I never felt safe in that apartment again, and I moved out within a month, leaving the shadow behind me, though I still wonder if it followed. Story 2: The Old Photograph. I stumbled upon an antique shop while wandering through town, and among the dusty shelves I found an old photograph in a tarnished frame. The image depicted a young woman in an elegant dress, her gaze piercing and unsettling. Intrigued, I bought it, thinking it would add a touch of character to my home. That night, I hung the photograph in my living room. As I settled down to relax, I felt a strange energy in the room, as if the air had thickened. I brushed it off and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced up, I felt the woman's gaze boring into me. Over the next few days, I began to experience bizarre occurrences. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in odd places, and I heard faint whispers late at night. It became unbearable when I woke one morning to find the photograph turned sideways, its frame askew. I was convinced that it was haunted, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Finally, one evening, I was awoken by a soft voice calling my name. I sat up, heart racing, and looked around the room. The photograph was glowing faintly, illuminating the dark corners. The woman in the picture seemed to be alive, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. I couldn't make out the words, but the sense of urgency was palpable. Terrified, I yanked the photograph off the wall and buried it in my closet, hoping to silence the whispers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had invited something sinister into my life, and I soon moved out, leaving the photograph behind, but it still lingers in my mind like a haunting memory. Story 3: The Disappearing Child. One crisp autumn evening, I was walking home from work when I saw a little girl standing alone on the sidewalk. She had a red coat and pigtails, looking lost and scared. Concerned, I approached her, asking if she was okay and where her parents were. She pointed down the street, her eyes wide and filled with tears. As I looked in the direction she pointed, I felt a chill run down my spine. The street was deserted, and the shadows lengthened as the sun dipped below the horizon. I turned back to her, but she had vanished. Confused, I searched the area, calling out for her, but there was no sign of anyone. Determined to help, I reported her disappearance to the police. They assured me they would investigate, but no one seemed to have seen the girl. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I began having nightmares of the girl standing at the end of my bed, her face pale and her expression pleading. One night, I was jolted awake by a soft voice whispering, "Help me." I opened my eyes, and there she was, standing in the corner of my room. I was frozen with fear, unable to speak. She pointed toward the window, and I realized the moonlight was casting shadows that danced along the walls. please," she pleaded. "I'm lost." The next morning, I drove back to the street where I had seen her. I felt compelled to look for her again. As I wandered, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown graveyard. My heart sank when I saw a headstone with the name of the little girl etched into it, her birth and death dates just a few years apart. I realized then that I hadn't just seen a lost child. I had seen a spirit seeking help. I left that place forever, haunted by her eyes and the desperate plea that still echoes in my mind. Story 4. The Mysterious Box. While cleaning out my grandmother's attic, I discovered a dusty old box tucked away in a corner. It was small and ornately carved, adorned with strange symbols that I didn't recognize. Curiosity piqued, I opened it, revealing a collection of trinkets, a locket, an old key, and a tarnished mirror. As I touched the items, a sudden chill swept through the attic, and I felt a strange energy pulsating from the box. I took it downstairs, eager to explore its contents further. That night, I placed the box on my bedside table, but as I tried to sleep, I was overwhelmed by a sense of unease. I kept hearing faint whispers, barely audible, but persistent. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me, a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Desperate to rid myself of the box, I decided to examine the locket more closely. As I opened it, I was struck by the image inside, my grandmother as a young woman, smiling brightly. But when I looked closer, I noticed a shadowy figure behind her, obscured yet unmistakable. My heart raced, and I slammed the locket shut. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and threw the box into the hallway. I could feel the weight of the energy still in the room, pressing down on me like a heavy fog. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, too frightened to go back to my room. The next day, I took the box and buried it deep in the backyard, hoping to put an end to the haunting whispers. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that box is still watching me, waiting for the day I might uncover it again. Story 5. The Flickering Lights. When I first moved into my new house, everything seemed perfect, until the lights began to flicker. At first, I thought it was just an electrical issue, but the flickering escalated to the point where lights would turn on and off by themselves. I called an electrician, but he found nothing wrong. I dismissed it, thinking it must be some odd quirk of the old wiring. One night, while trying to watch a movie, the lights began to flicker again, and I heard a soft thumping sound coming from the basement. I hesitated but felt compelled to investigate. Armed with only a flashlight, I crept down the creaky stairs. The air grew cold, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. As I reached the bottom, I saw shadows darting in the corners of my vision. The thumping grew louder, sounding like footsteps. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The flickering lights above me cast eerie shadows that danced along the walls, making the room feel alive. In a moment of desperation, I yelled, "Who's there?" The thumping stopped, and silence filled the air. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the shadows, whispering my name in a haunting tone. I felt a chill grip my spine, and I finally managed to pry the door open, bolting up the stairs and slamming it behind me. From that day on, I avoided the basement, and the flickering lights became a constant reminder of that terrifying night. I eventually moved out, but the chilling voice still lingers in my memory, a reminder that some houses hold secrets best left undiscovered. Story 6. The Doll in the Attic. When I inherited my late aunt's house, I was thrilled to discover an attic filled with old treasures. Among the dusty boxes and forgotten memories, one item caught my eye. A porcelain doll, perfectly intact despite its age. It had a delicate face with painted rosy cheeks and lifelike glass eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I couldn't resist bringing it down to my room, despite a nagging feeling that something was off. The first night with the doll was uneventful, but soon strange things began to happen. I would hear soft giggles echoing through the house, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the more time I spent with the doll, the stronger the feeling of unease became. I woke one night to find it sitting upright on my bedside table, its glassy eyes seemingly alive in the moonlight. Panicked, I decided to put the doll back in the attic, hoping to rid myself of the unsettling energy. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard the giggles again, now louder and more frantic. It felt like the air had thickened, pressing down on me. I placed the doll back in the box, but as I turned to leave, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I spun around, but the attic was empty. The laughter grew louder, now echoing in my head. I fled the attic, vowing never to return. I locked the door behind me, but I could still hear the whispers and laughter in my dreams, haunting me long after I left. Story 7. The Candlelit Seance. I always had an interest in the paranormal, so when my friends suggested we host a seance, I was thrilled. We gathered in my living room, dimmed the lights, and lit candles, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. We held hands and closed our eyes, focusing on connecting with the spirits. At first, it was all fun and games, with light-hearted jokes and laughter filling the air. But then the atmosphere shifted. A chill swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles, and we felt a palpable tension. The air grew heavy, and suddenly, one of my friends, Jessica, began to speak in a voice that wasn't her own, recounting a tragic story of loss and despair. We were entranced, but fear crept in as the story grew darker. The temperature dropped even further, and the remaining candles flickered violently. I could feel an unseen presence in the room, and the other girls began to panic. I urged Jessica to stop, but she continued, her voice rising in intensity, recounting the details of a murder that had taken place long ago in this very house. Just as she reached the climax of the tale, the last candle blew out, plunging us into darkness. I heard a whisper right next to my ear, cold and breathy. "You shouldn't have come here." The girls screamed and we all scrambled to turn on the lights. When the illumination returned, Jessica collapsed, unconscious. We never spoke of that night again, and I moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me from that darkened living room. Story 8. The Crying Baby. When I moved into my new apartment, I was charmed by its vintage character. But from the first night, I noticed strange noises. I attributed the odd creaks and groans to the building's age until the night I heard a baby crying. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing through the halls in a mournful wail. I stepped out of my apartment, hoping to find the source of the sound. As I wandered the dimly lit corridor, the crying grew louder, leading me to an old door at the end of the hall. It was locked, but the sound was so intense that I felt compelled to knock. My knuckles rapped against the wood, and the crying suddenly stopped. Confused, I turned to leave, but the door creaked open slightly, revealing a darkened room. I peered inside, and the air grew cold. Shadows danced along the walls, and I felt a pull toward the darkness. I stepped in, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged as I turned to find myself in a nursery filled with dusty toys and a crib that rocked gently, though there was no one in it. Suddenly, the crying resumed, but it was now accompanied by a soft, chilling lullaby. I felt a presence close behind me, and when I turned, I saw a fleeting glimpse of a woman in white, her face twisted in sorrow. I bolted for the door, desperately trying to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The cries intensified, and just as I thought I might be trapped forever, the door flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath. I never returned to that hallway again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the echoes of that haunting lullaby. Story 9. The Haunted Painting. My mother loved art, and after she passed away, I inherited her collection. Among the canvases was one peculiar painting that stood out, an eerie landscape with dark, swirling clouds and a distant figure barely visible in the background. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching me. Hanging it in my living room, I began to notice odd things. At night, the shadows in the painting seemed to shift, and the figure appeared to move closer. I brushed it off as a trick of the light, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Friends who visited commented on the unsettling aura of the painting, and soon I found myself avoiding the room altogether. One stormy evening, the power went out, and I was plunged into darkness. As I searched for candles, I heard a soft whisper emanating from the painting. "Help me." It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart raced as I turned to face it. The figure now appeared clear and distinct, its eyes filled with sorrow and despair. I felt drawn to the canvas, and before I knew it, I was standing inches away, staring into its depths. As the wind howled outside, the figure reached out, a hand emerging from the painting as if trying to escape. I stumbled back in horror, and the painting trembled on the wall, threatening to fall. I quickly took it down and locked it in the basement, but the whispers still haunt me, calling for help from the shadows. Story 10. The Forgotten Grave. During a hiking trip with friends, I stumbled upon a secluded area of the woods where the trees seemed to close in around us. As we ventured deeper, we found an old, forgotten graveyard, the headstones worn and faded. It felt eerie, almost as if the spirits of those buried there were watching us. One stone caught my eye. It was cracked and leaning, engraved with a name I recognized, Margaret Holloway. My grandmother had often spoken of a distant relative who had vanished without a trace years ago. I felt a strange pull toward the grave, and as I knelt down to examine it, I suddenly felt a chill in the air. My friends started to joke, urging me to hurry up, but something held me there. As I touched the headstone, I heard a whisper in my ear, a soft voice begging for help. I looked around, but my friends were laughing and unaware of what I had just experienced. I stood up, my heart racing, but when I turned to leave, the ground beneath me trembled, and a cold wind swept through the graveyard. Suddenly the air was filled with anguished cries, and I saw shadows moving among the trees, darting in and out of view. I bolted back to my friends, breathless, and urged them to leave. We stumbled out of the woods, and I never spoke of that day again. But late at night, I often think of Margaret and the whispers that lingered long after we escaped, wondering if I had disturbed something that should have remained undisturbed. Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. I moved into my grandmother's old house, excited to breathe new life into its worn-out walls. It was a beautiful old place, full of memories and charm, and I felt a deep connection to my family history. But almost immediately, I began to hear whispers at night, soft, unintelligible murmurs that sent chills down my spine. I brushed it off as my imagination, the creaking of the house settling. But one night I awoke to the sound of my name being called, faint but unmistakable. "Lily, come here." I bolted upright, heart racing. The voice felt so real, yet so distant. I followed the sound, drawn to the attic, which I had yet to explore. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw shadows flickering in the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat, and I hesitated. Compelled by an unexplainable force, I stepped inside. The whispers intensified, growing louder and more frantic, as if they were urging me to join them. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. In the darkness, I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I screamed, my voice echoing off the walls, and pounded on the door. But the whispers morphed into sinister laughter. Just when I thought I might be lost forever, the door creaked open. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, never looking back. I fled the house that night, vowing never to return. As I drove away, I could still hear the faint whispers in my mind, a chilling reminder that some places hold secrets better left undisturbed. Story 2. The Abandoned Nursery. The thrill of exploring an abandoned hospital was too tempting to resist. I had heard stories about the place, tales of lost children and ghostly apparitions. When I found the nursery, a wave of excitement washed over me. The peeling wallpaper and dusty toys painted a picture of a long-forgotten childhood, yet an unsettling feeling crept over me as I stepped inside. Almost immediately, I heard the soft sound of a child giggling, a sound so innocent it felt out of place. My heart raced as I looked around, half expecting to see a ghostly figure. But the room fell silent, leaving only the sound of my breathing. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Suddenly, the lullaby began playing from an old music box in the corner. The notes rang out, sweet yet haunting, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. My pulse quickened, and I pounded on it, calling for help. But the giggling grew louder, echoing in my ears like a taunt. In a frenzy, I felt around for a way out, but panic surged through me as I realized the music was still playing, accompanied now by the eerie laughter of unseen children. Just when I thought I might be trapped forever, the door creaked open on its own, and I bolted out into the night, never looking back. I left the hospital behind, but the echoes of that laughter haunted my dreams for weeks to come. Story 3. The Mirror's Reflection. Inheriting my aunt's ornate mirror was both a blessing and a curse. It was beautiful, intricately designed, but something about it felt off. Each time I looked into it, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if I were being watched. I often caught glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, while getting ready for bed, I glanced at my reflection and noticed a shadowy figure standing behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the room was empty. Dismissing it as fatigue, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. The following night, I heard soft sobbing coming from the mirror. My heart raced as I approached it, drawn by an invisible force. To my horror, the figure was there again. This time it looked desperate, its hands pressed against the glass as if trying to break free. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and in an instant, the reflection morphed into my aunt's anguished face. I stumbled back in terror, and the mirror shattered, but the sobbing continued, now echoing through my entire house. I covered the mirror and locked it away, convinced I had escaped whatever was trapped within, but the whispers still haunted me every night. I could feel her presence, desperately trying to communicate. I could only wonder what message she was trying to send, and what had truly happened to her. Story 4. The Forgotten Road. Driving through the woods late at night, I took a wrong turn and found myself on a forgotten road. The trees loomed over me like dark sentinels, and an unsettling fog rolled in, wrapping around my car like a shroud. I felt an urge to turn back, but something pulled me deeper into the woods. As I drove, the air grew thick with silence. Suddenly, my car stalled. I stepped out to investigate, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. The forest felt alive, and I felt like prey. I turned to head back to my car, but something was blocking my way. A figure, tall and hunched, watching me from the trees. I could see its eyes glimmering in the darkness, and I sprinted back, heart pounding, praying the car would start. To my relief, it roared back to life. As I sped off, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see the figure dissolve into the fog, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The next day, I tried to find that road again, but it was as if it had never existed. I've since learned to trust my instincts, knowing that sometimes the woods hold secrets that should remain hidden. Story 5. The Hidden Room. When I bought my new home, I was thrilled to discover an old bookshelf that hid a secret door. My excitement quickly turned to dread when I opened it and found a small, dusty room filled with old photographs of previous owners, each one looking more disturbed than the last. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I entered, sending a shiver down my spine. As I explored, I felt an unsettling presence behind me. I spun around, expecting to find a shadow, but instead the door slammed shut. Panic flooded my senses as I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard whispers circling around me, each one more frantic than the last. I pressed my ear against the door, desperately listening. In the silence, I could hear my name being called, my own voice echoing back at me. It was as if the room was alive, filled with the remnants of those who had come before me. I screamed and banged on the door, feeling the walls close in. Just when I thought I would suffocate in darkness, the door finally swung open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. I never spoke of that room again, but I could feel its presence lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for the next curious soul to unlock its secrets. I left the house, but I never truly left that room behind. Its whispers still echo in my mind, a constant reminder of what lies hidden. 1. The hollow walls. It started with whispers. I'd be sitting in my old armchair, the creak of the wooden floorboards under me as the wind battered the outside walls, when I'd hear it. At first, I dismissed it as nothing. Maybe the pipes, or the wind weaving its way through the cracks of my aging house. But soon, the whispers turned into light, fleeting footsteps, quick and almost imperceptible, dancing just on the other side of the wall. My heart would pound, and I'd call out into the empty room, my voice swallowed by the silence that followed. One night, unable to bear the sounds any longer, I pressed my ear to the wall. The moment I did, a cold breath met my skin, followed by a soft, chilling giggle that made my knees buckle. I stumbled back, heart racing. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No traces of forced entry, no sign of anyone but me. The noises persisted, and as days passed, they grew louder, more urgent. I stopped sleeping, each night spent staring at the walls, waiting. It was only when the wallpaper in the hallway began to bubble and tear that I realized the truth. There, in the narrow gap between the wooden beams, a pale eye stared back at me. I screamed as a hand reached out, clawing its way through the crumbling wall. 2. The Whispering Cellar. I'd always been told never to go into the cellar at my grandparents' farmhouse. It was old, with warped steps that groaned underfoot and shadows that moved as if they were alive. But curiosity gnawed at me. One evening, while everyone was asleep, I tiptoed down, candle in hand, into the musty darkness. At first, all I saw were cobwebbed shelves and dusty jars filled with unidentifiable things. Then I noticed the whispers. They were soft at first, indistinct, a gentle hiss that seemed to come from nowhere. I leaned closer to the stone walls, straining to catch the words. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and suddenly, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned to leave, but before I could, the candle flickered and went out. Panic surged as I stumbled in the dark, hands searching for the steps. That's when I felt it. A cold hand clasping mine, pulling me deeper into the blackness. I screamed, but no one came. When they found me the next morning, curled up and muttering in the corner, I could only repeat one thing. It's still down there. 3. The Watcher's Window. The old house at the end of the street had stood empty for years, its windows dark, the paint peeling like dead skin. I never paid it much attention until one evening as I passed by, I noticed a light flickering in the upstairs window. I stopped, peering through the gloom, and there, behind the cracked glass, a face stared back at me. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow my every move. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, nearly falling into the gutter. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But every night after, the same face was there, watching. Sometimes it was closer to the window, other times half hidden behind the tattered curtains, but always there, always watching. I finally called the police, and they searched the house from top to bottom. They found no signs of anyone, but they did find something disturbing. A set of handprints smeared in dust, trailing from the window to the attic hatch. "Looks like someone's been living here," the officer said. But who or what it was, we never found out. 4. The Basement Man. Moving into a new house should have been exciting, but from the first night I felt uneasy. The basement door was always cold to the touch, no matter how warm the rest of the house was. It creaked ominously whenever I passed, as if it were calling me to open it. One night, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, I flicked on the basement light and descended the creaking stairs. The air was damp, and a faint metallic smell made my nose wrinkle. Halfway down, the light flickered and went out. The darkness swallowed me, pressing in from all sides. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I froze as I heard shuffling below. Then came the voice, raspy and low. "You shouldn't be here!" Panic seized me, and I turned to bolt back up the stairs. Something cold brushed my ankle, and I tripped, clawing my way up the rest of the steps in blind terror. I slammed the door shut behind me and called the police. They found no one there, but the next day I found something they'd missed. A small, grimy handprint on the inside of the basement door. 5. The Stranger in the Closet. When I moved into my new apartment, I didn't mind the creaks and groans of the old building. It felt cozy in a way, like it had its own personality. But that changed when I began to notice the closet door in my bedroom. No matter how many times I locked it, it would always be ajar when I woke up. One night, determined to catch whatever draft or trick was causing it, I set up my phone to record. I fell asleep watching the sliver of darkness through the crack. I woke to the sound of the door creaking, my eyes snapping open to see a shape, tall and thin, emerging slowly from the closet. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, watching the figure stand there, motionless, head tilted as if observing me. I don't know how long I lay there, pretending to sleep while it hovered over me, breathing shallow and slow. Finally, as dawn light spilled through the curtains, it retreated back into the closet, pulling the door shut behind it. I moved out that very day, leaving the recording behind. I couldn't bring myself to watch it. Story 1: The Abandoned School. Exploring abandoned places has always intrigued me, so when I heard about an old school rumored to be haunted, I gathered a couple of friends and set out for an adventure. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark eyes watching us. As we stepped inside, a musty smell enveloped us, and the floor creaked under our weight, each step echoing in the silence. As we wandered through the dusty classrooms, I felt a chill creeping down my spine. It was as if the air was thick with whispers of the past. My friends laughed and joked to ease the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In one classroom, we found old desks and faded posters still clinging to the walls. I approached a chalkboard, half covered in dust, when I noticed a handprint smudged in the grime. Just then, a loud bang reverberated from the hallway, causing us to jump. We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. As we moved toward the source of the noise, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath in the air, and an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. We reached the hallway and noticed a door slowly creaking open at the far end. It was an old wooden door, its hinges groaning as if protesting against being disturbed. We hesitated, but the curiosity pulled us closer. As we neared the door, I could hear faint laughter echoing softly, like children playing. I felt a strong urge to run, but I couldn't bring myself to leave without knowing what was inside. Pushing the door open, we found a dimly lit room filled with old desks and chairs strewn about. as if a class had been interrupted. And in the center, a small child in an old-fashioned uniform sat, playing with a tattered ball. I blinked, and in an instant, she was gone, leaving only the sound of the ball rolling across the floor. We bolted out of the school, not looking back, the laughter of the children echoing in our ears long after we left. Story 2: The Whispering Woods. During a camping trip with friends, we decided to explore a nearby forest known for its stunning beauty. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the sunlight dimmed, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The atmosphere shifted, becoming heavy and oppressive. I felt an unease settle in my stomach, but I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I kept my concerns to myself. As night fell, we set up camp and gathered around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. But as the darkness deepened, I began to hear soft whispers floating through the trees. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the voices grew clearer, calling out in a language I didn't understand. My friends were laughing, unaware of the growing tension in the air. Later, as I tried to sleep, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the branches like a haunting lullaby. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart racing, and peered into the darkness. The shadows danced, and I could have sworn I saw figures moving among the trees, their forms indistinct but filled with intent. I shook my friend awake, but he groggily dismissed my concerns. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside the tent, hoping to shake off the feeling. As I stood in the cold night air, the whispers crescendoed, enveloping me. "Join us. Join us." They beckoned, chilling my blood. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with hollow eyes. I stumbled back, retreating into the tent, and shook my friends awake, insisting we leave. We packed up in a frenzy and left the campsite, the whispers trailing behind us like a dark fog. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something in those woods wanted me to stay, and I often wonder what might have happened if I had listened. Story 3: The Cursed Locket. While browsing a flea market, I came across an ornate locket that caught my eye. Its intricate design and beautiful gemstone drew me in, and I couldn't resist purchasing it. The seller warned me that it was cursed, but I dismissed it as a silly superstition. After all, it was just a piece of jewelry, right? That night, I wore the locket to dinner with friends. As the evening progressed, I began to feel uneasy, as if a weight were pressing down on my chest. I brushed it off, attributing it to my imagination. However, when I returned home, I noticed a strange sensation, an almost electric energy radiating from the locket, pulsing against my skin. Days turned into weeks, and strange occurrences began to plague me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the locket lying on the floor, despite having placed it on my nightstand. My dreams were filled with dark figures and ominous whispers, and I often felt an unseen presence watching me. My friends noticed my unease and urged me to get rid of the locket, but I couldn't bring myself to part with it. One evening, after another restless night, I sat on my bed staring at the locket. Suddenly, it flew open, revealing a faded photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. As I gazed at her, a cold wind rushed through my room, extinguishing the candles. I could hear her voice, clear and desperate, pleading for help. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt icy fingers wrap around my throat. Panicked, I hurled the locket against the wall, shattering it. The wind stopped instantly, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I knew I could never forget the curse that had lingered in that delicate piece of jewelry. I vowed never to buy anything from a flea market again. Story 4: The Ghostly Hitchhiker. Driving home late one night, I noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a woman in a white dress, her hair disheveled, looking lost and forlorn. My heart raced with concern, and I pulled over, rolling down my window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, feeling a mixture of curiosity and fear. To my surprise, she smiled faintly and climbed into the passenger seat. I could see that her eyes were filled with a sadness I couldn't explain. As I drove, she told me she was trying to get home, but she didn't seem to know where that was. I glanced over at her, and in that moment, I felt a chill grip my spine. There was something ethereal about her presence, as if she were more shadow than substance. We chatted briefly, but her responses were oddly vague, and I found it hard to focus. As we approached a dark stretch of road, she pointed to a nearby street. "Take that road," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. I turned, feeling compelled to follow her directions, but as I drove, I glanced over to find the seat beside me empty. Panic surged through me, and I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of her. I stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hello?" I called, but the night was silent, the only sound my own heartbeat. When I returned to the car, I noticed something on the seat. Her white dress. I picked it up, and as I did, I felt an overwhelming sadness wash over me. I later learned that a woman had died in a car accident at that very intersection many years ago. I shivered, realizing I had encountered the ghostly hitchhiker, forever searching for a way home. Story 5. The Eerie Music Box. While cleaning out my grandmother's attic, I stumbled upon an old music box covered in dust. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate designs etched into the wood. Curious, I wound it up, and as the haunting melody filled the air, I felt a chill run down my spine. The tune was familiar, evoking a strange sense of nostalgia, but I couldn't place it. That night, I placed the music box on my nightstand, unable to resist the urge to listen to it again. As the notes floated through the room, I began to feel drowsy. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, I found myself in a different place. I was in a dimly lit ballroom, surrounded by elegantly dressed couples dancing to the same eerie melody. The atmosphere was enchanting, yet unsettling, and I felt a presence beside me. A figure in a dark suit extended his hand, inviting me to dance. I hesitated but found myself unable to resist. As we twirled across the floor, I felt a sense of foreboding. His grip was cold, and I caught glimpses of shadowy figures lurking at the edges of the room. Suddenly, the music changed, becoming discordant and frantic. The dancers around us began to fade, their faces twisted in fear. I felt myself being pulled away from the man, panic rising within me. I fought to break free, but the music grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. Just as I thought I would be lost forever, I woke up in my bed, the music box still playing beside me. I never wound it up again, and I placed it in the back of the attic, hoping to bury the memory of that haunting dance. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint echoes of the melody, and I can't help. Story 1. The Flickering Screen. While sorting through my late uncle's belongings, I came across an old television set from the 1980s. It looked like a relic, but I thought it would be a fun addition to my living room as a quirky conversation piece. I plugged it in, and to my surprise, it flickered to life, the screen displaying static before settling on a channel filled with grainy images. At first, I found it amusing, the old cartoons playing in distorted form, but something felt off. The images shifted, and the sounds began to distort, fading into garbled laughter and strange whispers. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the old technology malfunctioning. As night fell, I settled down to watch, the flickering light casting eerie shadows around the room. Then, I noticed something strange. In the static, I could make out shadowy figures moving in the background, their faces obscured but their movements unnaturally jerky. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen, trying to discern what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figures turned to face me, their expressions twisted into grotesque smiles. I jumped back, gasping, and the TV suddenly cut out. The room fell silent, and I felt a chill sweep through the air. I tried to turn it back on, but the screen remained dark. Disturbed, I decided to leave it for the night. As I lay in bed, I heard faint laughter drifting through the walls, the same unsettling sound from the television. I convinced myself I was imagining things, but the next night, I felt compelled to try the TV again. As soon as I turned it on, the figures reappeared, now more defined, their mouths moving as if trying to speak. "Join us," they whispered in unison. Panic surged within me. I yanked the plug from the wall and hastily shoved the TV into the garage, vowing never to touch it again. Yet even now, in the silence of the night, I can still hear their laughter echoing in my mind. Story 2: The Unmarked Grave. While hiking in the countryside, I stumbled upon a small, overgrown cemetery hidden among the trees. It was a place that seemed long forgotten, the gravestones worn and tilted. One grave in particular caught my eye, an unmarked stone surrounded by wildflowers. An overwhelming sense of sadness washed over me, compelling me to approach. As I knelt beside the grave, I felt a strange warmth enveloping me. It was a serene moment, yet it felt heavy with unspoken stories. I glanced around, feeling as though I was being watched. The rustling leaves whispered secrets, and the air was thick with anticipation. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, hoping to research the grave later. But as I raised the camera, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing. The temperature dropped, and I heard a soft sobbing in the distance, drawing my attention. I looked up to see a figure standing among the trees, a woman in a flowing white dress, her face hidden by her long hair. She raised a hand, pointing toward the unmarked grave. Fear gripped me, but curiosity won. I stood and approached her, but as I did, she vanished, leaving only the sound of her weeping. I felt compelled to dig a little at the grave, driven by an unknown force. As I scraped away the soil, my heart raced. Suddenly, I uncovered a small, tarnished locket. It opened to reveal a faded photograph of the woman I had just seen, her face full of sorrow. I gasped as I realized she was reaching out for help even from beyond the grave. That night, I returned home, the image of her haunting me. I researched the area and discovered that the grave belonged to a woman who had vanished many years ago, her death shrouded in mystery. I returned to the cemetery the next day, but the grave was once again unmarked. It was as if the land had swallowed her secrets whole, leaving me to wonder if I had truly encountered her spirit, or if it was all just a figment of my imagination. Story 3: The Haunted Painting. While browsing an art gallery, I was drawn to a particular painting that seemed to resonate with me. It depicted a serene landscape, but there was a dark figure lurking in the shadows, barely visible. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching me. Despite the unsettling aura, I decided to purchase it, intrigued by the emotions it evoked. Once hung in my living room, the painting seemed to have a life of its own. At first, I admired it, but over time, I began to feel an oppressive weight whenever I looked at it. The figure appeared to shift positions subtly, its eyes following me as I moved around the room. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation grew stronger each day. One evening, as I was reading, I heard a soft whisper coming from the painting. "Help me!" I froze, my heart racing. I turned to look at it, and the figure seemed closer, its expression twisted in anguish. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the whispers continued, growing more desperate. "Please, don't leave me here." That night I couldn't sleep. I felt compelled to confront the painting. I stood in front of it, trembling, and asked, "What do you want?" To my shock, the figure seemed to shift again, its mouth moving silently. I reached out, half expecting something to happen, and the air around me thickened. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a loud crash from the other room. I spun around, startled, and when I turned back, the painting had fallen from the wall, shattering the frame. Inside, I found an old, faded letter addressed to someone named Margaret. It was filled with sorrowful words, detailing a life cut short. I buried the painting in the backyard, hoping to put the haunting behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers carried on the wind, and I wonder if Margaret is still searching for solace. Story 4. The Midnight Train. One night I was driving home late after a long shift at work. The roads were deserted, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I drove past an old train station, I noticed a flickering light coming from the platform. Curiosity piqued. I pulled over to investigate, remembering stories of an abandoned train that had been left to rust. As I stepped out of my car, I heard the distant sound of a train whistle, though no train was in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I approached the platform. The flickering light illuminated an old train car, its door slightly ajar. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, I felt an inexplicable pull to step inside. The interior was covered in dust, remnants of a bygone era. As I wandered through, I began to hear whispers, soft and urgent, beckoning me to come closer. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, sending chills down my spine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic surged within me, and I banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my ears. "Help us! Help us!" They were desperate, filled with pain. I stumbled through the train car, searching for a way out, but the windows were boarded up, and I felt a suffocating presence closing in on me. In a moment of sheer terror, I rushed to the door, throwing my weight against it. With one final push, it burst open, and I stumbled out onto the platform, gasping for air. The whispers faded, but I could still feel their presence lingering in the air. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see the train car illuminated in ghostly light, as if the spirits within were watching me leave. Story 5. The Old Hotel. My friends and I decided to spend a weekend at an old hotel known for its haunted history. The moment we arrived, the atmosphere felt heavy, filled with unspoken stories. As we checked in, the receptionist smiled but warned us to stay away from the third floor where strange occurrences were said to happen. Naturally, we were intrigued and decided to explore. The third floor was dimly lit and eerily quiet. As we wandered down the hallway, the air grew colder, and I could have sworn I saw shadows flicker at the edges of my vision. My friends laughed and joked, but I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. We approached one of the rooms, and the door creaked open on its own. Curiosity overwhelmed us, and we stepped inside. The room was frozen in time, with dusty furniture and peeling wallpaper. As I examined an old photograph on the wall, I felt a chill sweep through the room, and the door slammed shut behind us. The laughter faded as we realized we were trapped. We pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and then we heard it. A soft, melodic humming coming from the corner of the room. It was soothing, yet unnerving, and I felt a strange compulsion to follow the sound. I turned to see a figure standing by the window, cloaked in shadows, swaying gently to the tune. My friends and I exchanged terrified glances as the figure turned, revealing hollow eyes and an eerie smile. I screamed, and in that moment, the door swung open. We rushed out, fleeing the third floor and vowing never to return. As we checked out, I glanced back at the hotel, feeling a lingering sense of dread. I knew the stories were true, and some places should remain undisturbed, their secrets buried in the shadows.